Sometimes the most powerful moment in history happens when someone with everything chooses to give it all away for another person. What would you sacrifice to save someone you barely knew? In ancient Rome, a 17-year-old girl named Amaris was being auctioned as a slave. Her village had been destroyed for opposing the empire. The Roman nobles bid on her like she was property. Then Emperor Drustanus, the most feared ruler in history, stepped forward. He offered the entire treasury of Rome for this one girl. Everyone was shocked. This was the man who destroyed cities and killed his own family for power. Why would he risk everything for a stranger? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of the Roman Senate, where whispers of rebellion had been growing louder with each passing day. Senator Marcus Aurelius Cassius adjusted his purple-striped toga as he climbed toward the great bronze doors, his weathered face betraying none of the concern that gnawed at his thoughts. At 62, he had served 3 emperors, but none had troubled him quite like Drustanus. Emperor Gaius Drustanus Maximus had ruled Rome for 8 years, with an iron fist that made his predecessors look merciful by comparison. His rise to power had been swift and brutal, a calculated series of political assassinations, strategic marriages, and military conquests that left no room for sentiment. The man who now wore the purple had personally strangled his own brother when Lucius had shown weakness during the Gaulish campaigns. He had divorced his wife and exiled their children when political advantage demanded it. He was, by all accounts, the perfect Roman emperor for these turbulent times. Yet something had shifted in recent months, and the senators could sense it like wolves scenting blood on the wind. The emperor's private chambers overlooked the Campus Martius, where the finest athletes in the empire trained for the glory of Rome. From his marble balcony, Drustanus could see the Tiber winding its way through the city he controlled absolutely. The river reminded him of another waterway far to the north, where he had first learned that power came at the cost of one's soul. He had been 28 then, a general leading the 15th Legion against a coalition of mountain tribes who dared to harbor deserters from Caesar's armies. The campaign had been meant to be swift, crush the rebellion, make examples of the leaders, and return to Rome in triumph. Instead, it had become a grinding war of attrition against people who fought not for conquest, but for their very survival. The mountain village of Thyrsus had been their final stronghold. Nestled in a valley so remote that Roman maps barely acknowledged its existence, it had become a sanctuary for anyone fleeing the empire's justice. Runaway slaves, political dissidents, deserting soldiers, all had found refuge. Among the hardy mountain folk who asked no questions and demanded only that guests contribute to the common good, Drustanus remembered the morning they had surrounded the village. The mist had clung to the pine trees like the breath of dying gods, and somewhere in that ethereal veil lived people who had never bowed to Rome's eagles. His orders had been explicit. Take no prisoners, except for those young enough to be sold profitably in the slave markets. He had watched through his bronze war mask as his legionaries swept through the wooden houses like a plague. The villagers had fought bravely. He would give them that much. Farmers and shepherds had taken up hunting spears and wood axes against the finest military machine in the world. They had died as he expected them to die, but not as he expected them to live. An old woman, her grey hair braided with mountain flowers, had smiled at the centurion who ran her through with his gladius. A young father had used his body to shield his infant daughter, whispering words of love even as the life bled out of him. Children had comforted their dying mothers instead of weeping for themselves. In 8 years of wearing the purple, Drustanus had never forgotten those faces. The girl had been among the last captured. While her neighbors died around her, 17-year-old Amaris had fought like a cornered wildcat, wielding a bronze-headed spear that had belonged to her grandfather. She had wounded 2 legionaries before they overwhelmed her, and even then she had not begged for mercy or wept for the dead. She had simply stared at Drustanus with eyes that seemed to see straight through his mask to the hollow place where his humanity used to live. Now, 8 years later, she stood in chains on the auction block in the Forum Romanum, and those same eyes looked at him across a sea of jeering nobles. The slave auction was a monthly spectacle that drew Rome's elite like carrion birds to a battlefield. Senators and wealthy merchants gathered in the shadow of the Curia Julia to bid on human flesh with the same casual interest they showed when purchasing wine or silk. The auctioneer, a thin man named Gaius Volturnus, had a voice that could carry across the forum and a complete absence of conscience that made him perfect for his trade. "Behold the spoils of rebellion," Volturnus called out, gesturing toward the line of chained captives who represented the last survivors of the mountain campaign. Fresh from the northern provinces, these hardy specimens will serve your households faithfully or die in your arenas magnificently. The crowd laughed and applauded. To them, these were not people but commodities, investments that would cook their meals, tend their gardens, or provide entertainment in their games. The fact that each slave had once been someone's child, parent, or beloved meant nothing in the economics of empire. Senator Cassius fingered his purse and considered the merits of a young man who looked strong enough for heavy labor. Beside him, the wealthy merchant Lucius Flavius eyed a middle-aged woman who might serve well as a kitchen slave. The morning sun climbed higher, and the bidding grew more animated as wine loosened tongues and opened purses. Then they brought out Amaris. The crowd fell silent for a moment, not from respect but from appraisal. She walked with her head held high, despite the iron shackles that bound her wrists and ankles. Her dark hair fell in waves across shoulders that bore the scars of her final battle, and her green eyes surveyed the assembly with a dignity that should have been impossible for someone in her position. "Now here," Volturnus announced with practiced theatrical flair, "is a true prize, young, untouched, and spirited enough to provide years of service. Look at those eyes, gentlemen, fire that can be tamed with the right hand. Who will start the bidding at 50 aurae?" The response was immediate. Hands shot up around the forum as Rome's finest competed for the privilege of owning her. The bidding climbed quickly, 75 aurae, 100, 150. Senator Cassius found himself caught up in the excitement. Raising his hand at 200 aurae before common sense reasserted itself. At 500 aurae, only 3 bidders remained. A Syrian merchant known for his exotic tastes, a senator whose wife had recently died and who was said to be seeking companionship, and a gladiator trainer who specialized in female fighters for private exhibitions. 550 aurae, called the merchant. 600, encountered the senator. The gladiator trainer hesitated, calculating the potential return on his investment. 600 aurae was a substantial sum, even for someone in his profitable but brutal profession. The girl was certainly beautiful enough to draw crowds, and if she fought as fiercely as her reputation suggested, she might last several seasons in the arena. 650 aurae, he called out, and the crowd cheered its approval. Senator Cassius shook his head in amazement. In his younger days, a man could purchase a fine villa for such a sum. Now they were spending it on a single slave girl, however exceptional she might be. The decadence of the empire seemed to grow with each passing year. Volturnus raised his wooden gavel, preparing to close the bidding. 650 aurae. Going once, I bid the treasury of Rome. The voice cut through the forum's noise like a blade through silk, and every head turned toward its source. Emperor Drustanus stood at the edge of the crowd, his purple cloak marking his rank as clearly as the golden laurel crown that circled his brow. The forum fell silent, except for the distant sound of fountains and the nervous shuffle of sandals on stone. For a long moment, no one moved. The emperor's bid was so unprecedented, so impossible to comprehend, that the crowd seemed frozen in disbelief. The treasury of Rome contained the wealth of the known world, Gold from Gaul, silver from Spain, precious stones from the far reaches of the empire. It represented the labor and tribute of 50 million souls, the accumulated power of centuries of conquest, and Drustanus had just offered all of it for a slave girl. Volturnus found his voice first, though it came out as little more than a croak. "Your Imperial Majesty, surely you jest." "I never jest about matters of state," Drustanus replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had cowed rebellious provinces and hostile senators alike. "The treasury of Rome against all other bids. Do you accept?" The auctioneer looked around the forum helplessly, seeking guidance from someone, anyone who might understand what was happening. But the senators were as stunned as the merchants, and the merchants as bewildered as the common citizens who had gathered to watch the spectacle. Senator Cassius felt his mouth go dry. In all his years of public service, through civil wars and political upheavals, foreign invasions and domestic crises, he had never witnessed anything quite so shocking. The emperor was risking everything, his power, his position, perhaps his very life, for reasons that no rational mind could fathom. Amaris herself seemed untouched by the drama swirling around her. She stood on the auction block with the same quiet dignity she had maintained throughout the proceedings, neither grateful for her unexpected salvation, nor particularly interested in the identity of her purchaser. She had accepted her fate as a slave with the stoic resignation of her mountain people, and if that fate now involved serving an emperor instead of a merchant or gladiator trainer, it made little practical difference to her circumstances. But she did look at Drustanus, and in that look was something that made the emperor remember why he had first noticed her all those years ago. It was not fear or gratitude or even curiosity. It was recognition, the acknowledgement of one soul by another across the vast gulf that separated conqueror from conquered, master from slave, emperor from victim. Volturnus finally found his voice again. The treasury of Rome it is, Your Imperial Majesty. The girl is yours." As the crowd began to murmur and shift, as senators exchanged worried glances and merchants calculated the implications for their own fortunes, Drustanus walked forward to claim his prize. But he did not see Amaris as a possession to be owned. In her defiant green eyes, he saw a mirror that reflected back all the choices he had made, all the prices he had paid, and all the humanity he had sacrificed. In his climb to absolute power, the bronze pendant that hung from her neck, a simple mountain symbol that had somehow survived 8 years of captivity, caught the morning sunlight and seemed to glow like a star. It was the only thing she owned in the world, the last connection to everything she had lost, and as Drustanus looked at it, he began to understand why he had just wagered an empire on a single human life. The imperial palace had witnessed many strange processions in its marble halls, but none quite like the one that followed Drustanus through the corridors that afternoon. Behind the emperor walked Amaris, her chains removed, but her wrists still bearing the red marks where iron had bitten into flesh. Palace guards flanked them at a respectful distance, their faces carefully neutral despite the questions burning in their eyes. Senator Cassius had followed the procession from the forum, along with a handful of other senators who claimed urgent business with the emperor. In truth, they were driven by the same morbid curiosity that draws crowds to public executions, the need to witness history unfolding, even when that history might spell doom for them all. The throne room of the palace was a monument to Roman power. Marble columns reached toward a ceiling painted with scenes of imperial triumph, while mosaics depicting conquered peoples decorated the floors beneath their feet. At the far end of the vast chamber sat the throne itself, a chair of ivory and gold that had been the seat of absolute power for 3 centuries. Drustanus did not take his throne. Instead, he stood before it, studying the girl who had cost him an empire. In the soft light filtering through the high windows, Amaris looked even younger than her 17 years. The defiance that had sustained her through the auction was still there, but beneath it lay exhaustion deeper than mere physical fatigue. "You may speak freely," the Emperor said, his voice echoing slightly in the vast space. "No harm will come to you for honest words." Amaris raised her eyes to meet his, and for a moment the throne room might have been empty save for the two of them. "Why?" she asked simply. It was the question that had followed them from the forum. The question that burned in every senator's mind and would soon spread through the streets of Rome like wildfire. Why would the most powerful man in the world risk everything for a single slave? Drustanus was quiet for so long that the senators began to shift uncomfortably. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of years of buried regret. 8 years ago, I watched your village burn. I gave the order that made you a slave. I have conquered 12 provinces and killed more men than I can count, but I have never forgotten the way you looked at me that day. Senator Cassius felt a chill run down his spine. The emperor was confessing to what amounted to treason, admitting that he had been haunted by the consequences of his own actions, showing weakness that his enemies could exploit. In Rome, mercy was a luxury that emperors could not afford. "You remember me," Amaris said. "It was not a question. I remember all of you. Your grandfather, who died trying to protect your village's shrine. Your mother, who cursed me with her last breath. Your father, who begged me to spare you and died believing I had refused." The silence that followed was profound. Even the senators, accustomed to the theater of politics, seemed awed by the raw honesty in the emperor's voice. "They were good people," Amaris said quietly. "They never hurt anyone. They just wanted to live in peace." "I know." The admission seemed to cost Drustanus something essential. "I have justified many things in the name of Rome's glory. I've told myself that the strong have the right to rule the weak, that order justifies any amount of suffering. But I have never been able to justify what I did to Thyrsis." Senator Cassius exchanged glances with his colleagues. They were witnessing something unprecedented. An emperor acknowledging doubt, admitting error, showing the kind of human vulnerability that Roman law did not permit in its rulers. The implications were staggering. "Your Imperial Majesty," Cassius ventured carefully, "perhaps it would be wise to continue this conversation in private." "No." Drustanus turned to face the assembled senators, and they saw in his eyes a resolve that was somehow more frightening than his legendary cruelty had ever been. "Let Rome hear what its emperor has to say. I have spent 8 years trying to forget the faces of the innocent dead. I have drowned their memory in conquest and blood, told myself that their sacrifice served a greater purpose. But standing in that forum today, seeing her on that auction block, I realized that some crimes cannot be justified, no matter how necessary they seem at the time. The senators were trapped between their desire to flee and their need to understand what was happening to their empire." Marcus Flavius, a man who had served under 3 emperors, cleared his throat nervously. "Your Majesty speaks of crimes, but surely the pacification of rebellious provinces is merely pacification." Drustanus repeated the word as if tasting something bitter. "A clean word for an ugly reality. We call it pacification when we slaughter farmers defending their homes. We call it justice when we enslave children whose only crime was being born in the wrong place. We have made a virtue of brutality and called it Roman law." Amaris watched this exchange with growing amazement. In her years of captivity, she had imagined this moment countless times, standing before the man who had destroyed her world, finally able to speak the truth she had carried like a stone in her heart. But she had never imagined that he would speak it first. "The girl cannot remain in the palace," Senator Cassius said, trying to steer the conversation toward practical matters. "The people will not understand. The Senate will demand explanations that cannot be given. Then perhaps it is time for the Senate to hear some uncomfortable truths." Drustanus moved to stand beside Amaris, and the symbolic weight of the gesture was not lost on anyone present. "This girl represents the cost of our glory. She is the price we pay for calling ourselves civilized while we devour the world around us." "Your Majesty," Senator Flavius said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic, "such words could be seen as questioning the very foundations of our empire." "I am questioning them," Drustanus replied calmly. "I am questioning whether an empire built on the bones of innocence can truly call itself great. I'm questioning whether a man who has forgotten how to feel mercy can truly call himself human." The throne room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt dangerous. The senators could sense the ground shifting beneath their feet, feel the carefully ordered world of Roman politics beginning to crack along lines they could not see. Amaris broke the silence with words that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than memory. "My grandmother used to say that the gods judge us not by what we take, but by what we choose to give back." Drustanus turned to look at her, and in that moment something passed between them that the watching senators could not define. It was not love. That was too simple a word for what they witnessed. It was recognition, understanding, the meeting of two souls who had been shaped by the same terrible events and had somehow found their way to opposite sides of forgiveness. "What would you have me give back?" the emperor asked. "I don't know," Amaris admitted. "I'm not wise enough to heal the world, but maybe we could start by remembering that every person we hurt has a name, a family, a life that matters as much as our own." Senator Cassius felt the world tilting around him. In 30 years of political maneuvering, he had never heard an emperor speak of healing the world or remembering the names of his victims. Such language was the province of philosophers and dreamers, not the rulers of the greatest empire in history. But as he looked at Drustanus standing beside the mountain girl, he saw something that terrified him more than any military defeat or political upheaval. He saw an emperor who was remembering how to be human, and in Rome, humanity was the most dangerous luxury of all. Outside the palace walls, word of the unprecedented auction was already spreading through the city like smoke from a signal fire. In taverns and marketplaces, citizens whispered about their emperor's strange behavior. Some laughed, dismissing it as the eccentricity of absolute power. Others frowned, sensing instability in the foundations of their world. But in the throne room, as afternoon shadows lengthened across marble floors, two people who had been shaped by tragedy began the slow, dangerous work of learning to see each other as human beings rather than symbols of conquest and defeat. Neither of them knew that their tentative steps toward understanding would shake an empire to its core. The imperial household had seen many changes over the centuries, but none had prepared the palace staff for the arrival of Amaris. She was neither concubine nor wife, neither servant nor guest. She existed in a category that had no name in the carefully ordered hierarchy of Roman power. Helena, the palace's head servant, had served the imperial family for 20 years. She had weathered the transition from one emperor to the next, adapted to changing tastes and temperaments, and prided herself on her ability to anticipate her master's needs. But as she stood outside the chamber that Drustanus had assigned to Amaris, she found herself completely at a loss. The emperor requests that she be treated as an honored guest, Helena murmured to her assistant, a young woman named Claudia, who had joined the household just 3 years earlier. But honored guests do not arrive in chains from the slave market. Honored guests have families, histories, proper introductions. Claudia peered through the partially open door at the girl sitting by the window. Amaris had not moved for hours, had not asked for food or drink or even basic necessities. She simply sat and stared out at the gardens below, as still as a statue carved from mountain stone. "Perhaps she's in shock," Claudia suggested. "After what she's been through is slavery," Helena replied curtly. "Thousands of people are enslaved every year. They don't all end up in the imperial palace, costing the emperor the treasury of Rome." The financial implications of Drustanus's bid were still being calculated by the imperial accountants, but early estimates suggested that the emperor had effectively bankrupted the state for a single human being. Tax revenues that should have funded the legions for the next 5 years had been wagered on a girl who now sat silently in a room overlooking the palace gardens. Meanwhile, in his private study, Drustanus was discovering that purchasing someone's freedom and earning their trust were entirely different challenges. He had sent word that Amaris should be brought whatever she needed: food, clothing, books, entertainment, but she had requested nothing. The servants reported that she ate sparingly when meals were brought to her, spoke only when directly addressed, and spent most of her time gazing out the window as if memorizing every detail of the world beyond the palace walls. She could escape. His personal bodyguard, Marcus Brutus Maximus, observed as he reviewed the day's security reports. The man was no relation to the famous assassin who bore the same name, but he shared his predecessor's practical approach to potential threats. The chamber you've given her overlooks the outer wall. A determined person could climb down to the courtyard and be beyond the gates before anyone noticed. Drustanus looked up from the correspondence he'd been pretending to read. And why hasn't she? I don't know, Caesar. Perhaps she understands that there's nowhere in the Empire she could hide from your reach. Or perhaps she has nowhere to go. The Emperor set down his stylus and moved to his own window, which offered a view of the chamber where Amaris sat. Even at this distance, he could see her profile silhouetted against the afternoon light. Her village is gone. Her family is dead. Her people are scattered to the winds. What freedom would escape offer her? Brutus frowned. In his experience, freed slaves typically wanted nothing more than to put as much distance as possible between themselves and their former masters. The fact that this girl seemed content to remain in the palace troubled him more than an escape attempt would have. The senators are growing restless, he reported, changing the subject to more familiar territory. Cassius has called for a private meeting of the senior members. They're using words like instability and questionable judgment. Let them talk. Drustanus' voice carried an edge that Brutus recognized, the quiet danger that preceded the Emperor's most decisive actions. I've given them 8 years of profitable conquest and stable rule. One act of irregularity does not negate my entire reign, but even as he spoke the words, Drustanus knew they weren't entirely true. In Rome, perception mattered as much as reality. An emperor who showed weakness, who made decisions based on emotion rather than calculated political advantage, invited challenges from ambitious senators and discontented generals. The treasury bid had been seen by too many people, had generated too much gossip to be dismissed as a momentary aberration. As evening approached, the emperor made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He instructed the kitchen staff to prepare a simple meal: bread, cheese, olives, and watered wine, and announced that he would deliver it personally to his strange guest. Helena nearly dropped the oil lamp she was carrying when the emperor appeared at Amaris's door, bearing a wooden tray. In 20 years of palace service, she had never seen a ruler of Rome carry anything more substantial than a ceremonial scroll. "Your Imperial Majesty," she stammered. "Surely a servant could—" "Thank you, Helena, but this is something I need to do myself." Drustanus' tone was polite but final. "Please see that we are not disturbed." The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving the emperor alone with the girl whose freedom had cost him an empire's worth of gold. Amaris turned from the window as he entered, her expression unreadable. She had been given clean clothing, a simple white tunic that emphasized her youth, and someone had braided her dark hair in the Roman fashion. But her green eyes remained as watchful and untamed as they had been on the auction block. "I brought food," Drustanus said, setting the tray on a small table near the window. "The kitchen staff weren't sure what you might prefer." "Anything is fine." Her voice was soft but clear, carrying the mountain accent that marked her as foreign even after years in captivity. "I'm not used to having preferences." The emperor found himself at a loss for words. He had commanded legions, negotiated with kings, and addressed the Senate on matters of life and death. But sitting across from this girl, he felt as uncertain as a boy stumbling through his first conversation with a stranger. "You could leave," he said finally. "I could arrange safe passage to any province in the Empire. New identity, enough gold to start a new life wherever you choose." Amaris considered this offer with the same serious attention she gave everything else. "And go where? Do what?" "I've been a slave for 8 years. I have no skills except survival, no friends except the dead, no home except my memories. You could learn. There are schools, tutors, opportunities to become what? There was no bitterness in her voice, only a profound weariness that seemed far too old for her 17 years. A freed woman with a mysterious past, a curiosity to be whispered about in markets and bathhouses. The girl who cost an emperor his treasury? Drustanus flinched at the accuracy of her assessment. She was right, of course. Her story was already spreading through Rome, growing more elaborate with each telling. By tomorrow, the entire city would know about the slave who had somehow bewitched their emperor into bankrupting the state. "Then what do you want?" he asked. Amaris was quiet for a long moment, her gaze returning to the window and the world beyond. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of 8 years of unanswered questions. "I want to understand why you remember my family's faces when you've killed so many people. I want to know why a man who destroyed my world would risk everything to save me from slavery. I want to understand what it means that the most powerful person in the empire feels guilty about the choices that made him powerful." She turned back to face him, and in her eyes he saw not accusation, but genuine curiosity. "I think," she said quietly, "that before I can decide what I want to do with my freedom, I need to understand what freedom means to someone who has all the power in the world, but still feels trapped by his choices." For the first time in 8 years, Emperor Drustanus found himself facing a challenge that could not be solved with legions or gold or political maneuvering. He was being asked to examine his own soul by someone who had every reason to hate him, and he was discovering that he lacked the courage to refuse. The leather-bound journal had belonged to Drustanus's father, Marcus Aurelius Drustanus, a senator who had died when his son was 15. Hidden beneath piles of military correspondence and imperial decrees, it had remained untouched for over 20 years. Now, as dawn light filtered through the emperor's private study, he found himself reading words that seemed to come from another world entirely. Power corrupts not because it changes who we are, but because it forces us to become what we think we must be to keep it, his father had written in careful, measured script. Each choice we make in service of strength takes us further from the person we once hoped to become. Drustanus closed the journal and rubbed his tired eyes. He had spent the night reading his father's private thoughts, reflections on duty, morality, and the terrible weight of leadership that had apparently haunted the older man until his death. It was like discovering that his childhood home had secret rooms he had never known existed. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. "Enter," he called, expecting to see Brutus with the morning's intelligence reports. Instead, Amaris stood in the doorway, wearing the same simple white tunic, but carrying something in her hands, a small cloth bundle that she held carefully, as if it contained something precious. "I brought you something," she said, approaching his desk with the same cautious dignity she brought to everything else. "The guards said you had been awake all night." She unwrapped the bundle to reveal bread, honey, and what appeared to be an herbal tea that filled the study with the scent of mountain flowers. Drustanus stared at the simple meal, momentarily speechless. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "I asked the kitchen servants to teach me how to prepare food the way my grandmother used to make it." Amaris set the tea before him, steam rising from the clay cup. They were curious about mountain cooking methods. The emperor took a sip of the tea, and suddenly he was transported back to his campaign in the northern provinces. He remembered the same scent drifting from the homes his legions had burned, remembered thinking how strange it was that people facing death would take time to brew tea for their families. "Why?" he asked. Amaris seated herself across from his desk without being invited, a breach of protocol that would have cost anyone else their life, but which somehow seemed perfectly natural. "Because last night you looked like someone who had forgotten how to take care of himself. And because my grandmother always said that sharing food was the first step toward understanding anyone. Your grandmother was a wise woman." She was. Amaris's voice carried a note of old grief. "Carefully controlled," She used to say that even the worst people have reasons for their choices, and that understanding those reasons doesn't excuse the harm they cause, but it might prevent future harm. Drustanus set down the teacup and studied the girl before him. In the morning light, her youth was even more apparent, but there was something ancient in her green eyes, a depth of experience that reminded him uncomfortably of his father's journal. "The senators met last night," he said. "They're calling for a formal inquiry into my financial decisions. Some are suggesting that I've been compromised by foreign influences, meaning me, meaning you." He leaned back in his chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 36 years. "They're not entirely wrong. Your presence here has compromised my position considerably." Amaris considered this with the same thoughtful attention she gave everything else. "Do you regret bidding on me?" The question hung in the air between them like incense smoke. Drustanus had asked himself the same thing dozens of times since leaving the forum, had weighed the political costs against. What had he gained that was worth risking an empire? "No," he said finally, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "I regret many things about my life, but saving you from slavery is not one of them, even though it might destroy you. Especially because it might destroy me." The admission came from somewhere deeper than political calculation. "For 8 years I've been the perfect Roman emperor, ruthless, decisive, uncompromising. I've conquered my enemies and crushed rebellions and accumulated more power than any man in history. But I've also become someone my father would not recognize." He gestured toward the journal on his desk. "He wrote about the danger of becoming what you think you must be. I spent so many years convincing myself that cruelty was strength, that mercy was weakness, that the strong had the right to rule the weak. But seeing you on that auction block, I realized that I had become exactly the kind of man he warned against." Amaris reached across the desk and touched the journal's leather cover. "May I?" Drustanus nodded, watching as she opened to a random page and read his father's words in silence. When she looked up, there were tears in her eyes. "He sounds like my grandfather," she said softly. "He used to tell me that the measure of a person isn't what they do when everyone is watching, but what they do when they think no one will ever know." "And what do you think he would say about an emperor who bankrupts his empire to free a single slave?" Amaris smiled, the first genuine smile he had seen from her since the auction. It transformed her face completely, revealing the girl she might have been if her world had never burned. "I think he would say that empires come and go, but the choice to value one human life over all the gold in the world, that's the kind of choice that echoes through eternity." Before Drustanus could respond, the study door burst open. Brutus entered without ceremony, his face grim with the kind of news that could not wait for proper protocol. "Caesar, forgive the intrusion, but we have a situation. The Gallic legions have declared for General Maximus Crassus. They're marching on Rome." The emperor rose from his chair, the peaceful moment shattered by the harsh reality of politics and power. Crassus was his most dangerous rival, a general with enough military support to challenge for the throne, and enough political cunning to exploit any sign of weakness. "How long do we have?" Drustanus asked, his mind already shifting to military calculations. 3 weeks, maybe 4 if we're fortunate. "The other legions are wavering. They're not sure whether to support you or wait to see which way the wind blows." Amaris watched this exchange with growing understanding. Her presence in the palace had not just compromised the emperor politically, it had provided his enemies with exactly the excuse they needed to move against him. The girl who had cost him a treasury was now costing him an empire. "This is my fault," she said quietly. Drustanus turned to look at her, seeing not the cause of his troubles, but the first honest relationship he had formed in years. "No," he said firmly. "This is the consequence of choices I made long before I met you. Crassus has been planning this move for months. He was simply waiting for the right opportunity, but I gave him that. Opportunity. You gave me something more valuable than opportunities or empires," the emperor replied, surprising both Amaris and Brutus with the certainty in his voice. You reminded me who I used to be before I became what I thought I had to be. As Brutus began outlining defensive strategies, and Amaris quietly gathered the remnants of their simple breakfast, Drustanus realized that he was facing the greatest challenge of his reign. But for the first time in 8 years, he was facing it as a man who remembered the difference between strength and cruelty, between leadership and domination. The question now was whether remembering his humanity would be enough to save his empire, or whether some prices were worth paying regardless of the cost. The war council convened in the palace's ancient amphitheater, where marble seats that had once hosted entertainments now held Rome's most powerful military leaders. Maps of the empire covered the central floor, marked with colored stones representing legions, supply lines, and strategic positions. The air was thick with tension, and the smoke of oil lamps that had burned through the night. General Lucius Varro, commander of the Praetorian Guard, pointed to a cluster of red stones representing Crassus's advancing forces. He's moving faster than expected. The 7th and 12th legions joined him yesterday at Ravenna. That gives him nearly 30,000 men, all battle-tested veterans. Senator Cassius leaned forward in his seat, his face pale in the lamplight. What about our allies? Surely the governors of the loyal provinces will send support. The governors are hedging their bets, interrupted Admiral Marcus Nautilus, whose Mediterranean fleet represented Rome's naval power. Half of them are sending messages of support while secretly negotiating with Crassus's representatives. They want to be on the winning side when the dust settles. Drustanus studied the map in silence, his fingers tracing the roads that led to Rome. In his years as emperor, he had faced external threats from Germanic tribes, Gallic rebellions, and Egyptian political upheavals. But civil war was different, more personal, more destructive, and infinitely more dangerous to the stability of the empire. We have the advantage of position, he said finally. Rome itself is virtually impregnable, and the loyalty of the urban legions is unquestioned. If we can hold the city while raising support from the eastern provinces, that assumes we have time to raise support, Varro interrupted. Crassus isn't planning a siege. He's planning to present himself as the rightful emperor and dare us to oppose him. If enough of the Senate supports his claim, they won't. The voice came from the amphitheater's upper seats, where Amaris sat in a section normally reserved for scribes and record keepers. Every head turned toward her, some with surprise, others with barely concealed hostility. Senator Cassius found his voice first. I hardly think a former slave is qualified to comment on the loyalty of the Roman Senate. She's qualified to comment on human nature, Drustanus said, silencing the senator with a look. Continue, Amaris. She rose from her seat and walked down to the council floor, seemingly unbothered by the stares that followed her movement. Crassus is offering the senators what they think they want. A return to the old ways, an emperor who won't challenge their comfortable assumptions about power and privilege. But he's also asking them to commit treason against their current emperor, and senators don't like unnecessary risks. General Varro frowned. What's your point? My point is that most of them will wait to see which side is stronger before declaring their loyalty. They're not brave enough to lead a rebellion, but they're not loyal enough to die preventing one. Amaris picked up a white stone from the map and placed it between the red stones representing Crassus and the blue stones representing loyal forces. The real battle isn't military. It's about which leader can convince Rome that victory is inevitable. The council chamber fell silent as the implications of her words sank in. Admiral Nautilus was the first to speak. The girl has a point. In civil wars, perception often matters more than reality. If Crassus can convince people that his victory is certain, they'll join him to avoid being on the losing side. Then we need to change that perception, Drustanus said. We need to show Rome that supporting Crassus means supporting chaos and instability, while supporting the legitimate emperor means supporting order and prosperity. Senator Cassius shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Your Imperial Majesty, with respect, recent events have raised questions about stability. in the current administration as well. The reference to the treasury bid was unmistakable, and every person in the chamber understood its implications. Drustanus had given his enemies a weapon to use against him, and they would not hesitate to wield it. "You're referring to my decision to free Amaris from slavery," the Emperor said calmly. "You think it demonstrates poor judgment or political weakness? I think it demonstrates that even emperors can be influenced by emotions rather than reason," Cassius replied carefully. "And in times of crisis, people look for leaders who make decisions based on cold calculation rather than personal feelings." Amaris felt the weight of every gaze in the chamber. She understood now why palace servants whispered when she passed, why guards looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. She was not just a freed slave. She was a symbol of their emperor's humanity, and in Rome, humanity was often seen as a liability rather than a strength. "Perhaps," she said quietly. "That's exactly what Rome needs right now." The chamber erupted in surprised murmurs. General Varro looked scandalized, while Senator Cassius appeared to be choking on his own indignation. "Explain," Drustanus said, his voice cutting through the noise. Amaris moved to the center of the map, standing among the colored stones that represented the fate of millions. "Crassus is offering Rome more of what it's always had, more conquest, more brutality, more fear. He's promising to be the kind of emperor who values strength over mercy, who sees people as tools rather than human beings." She picked up a blue stone and held it up to the lamplight. But what if Rome had an emperor who remembered that strength without compassion is just another form of weakness? What if the people could follow a leader who was powerful enough to conquer enemies, but wise enough to forgive them afterward? "Pretty words," Varro said dismissively, "but armies don't follow philosophers. They follow winners. They follow leaders who give them something worth fighting for," Amaris countered. "Crassus can offer his soldiers plunder and glory, but what happens after the victory? What happens when there are no more enemies to defeat, no more cities to sack? All he offers is an endless cycle of violence that eventually consumes itself." She looked directly at Drustanus, and in her eyes he saw the reflection of possibilities he had never dared to imagine. But an emperor who values human life, who sees conquest as a means to peace rather than an end in itself, that's a leader who could offer Rome something it's never had before, the chance to build something lasting, something worth preserving for future generations. The silence that followed was different from the hostile quiet that had greeted her earlier words. This time, the council members seemed to be genuinely considering what she had said, weighing it against their own understanding of politics and human nature. Finally, Admiral Nautilus spoke. "It's an interesting theory, but it assumes that people want to follow a merciful leader. Roman history suggests otherwise." "Roman history was written by the victors," Amaris replied. "But what about the history that was never written? The voices of the conquered, the enslaved, the forgotten? What would they say about the choice between fear and hope?" As the council continued their deliberations into the early hours of morning, a new dynamic began to emerge. The military leaders spoke of tactics and logistics. The senators worried about political implications. But increasingly, they found themselves returning to the fundamental question that Amaris had raised. What kind of empire did they want to preserve? And in asking that question, they began to discover that the greatest threat to Drustanus's reign might not be Crassus's advancing legions, but Rome's own inability to imagine a future different from its violent past. The ancient olive tree in the palace gardens had witnessed 3 centuries of imperial history, its gnarled branches providing shade for countless private conversations between rulers and their confidants. Under its silver-green canopy, Drustanus and Amaris walked the gravel paths, while Rome prepared for war around them. "Tell me about your father," Amaris said, pausing beside a fountain where marble dolphins spouted water into a basin carved with scenes of naval victories. Not the senator everyone remembers, but the man who wrote those words in his journal. Drustanus considered the question. realizing that he had rarely thought of his father as anything other than a political figure. He was careful, thoughtful. He used to spend hours in his study, reading philosophy and history, trying to understand how great civilizations rose and fell. Did he love your mother? The unexpected personal question caught the emperor off guard. I believe so. She died when I was young, but I remember them talking together in the evenings. Real conversations, not just political discussions. He would ask her opinion about things, and she would challenge his ideas without being disrespectful. Amaris nodded, understanding something in his tone that he had not expressed directly. You never had that kind of partnership. Emperors don't have partnerships. We have political alliances disguised as marriages. The bitterness in his voice surprised them both. My wife was chosen for her family connections. Our children were raised by tutors and nurses. When I divorced her for political advantage, she seemed almost relieved to escape the palace. They continued walking past beds of roses that filled the air with their sweet fragrance. Palace gardeners worked quietly among the flowers, pruning and watering with the kind of patient care that Drustanus had never applied to human relationships. What about your children? Amaris asked. Do you miss them? The question hit him like a physical blow. He stopped walking, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. I exiled them to prevent civil war. Their existence posed a threat to political stability, and stability was more important than being their father. Yes. The admission came out as barely more than a whisper. I told myself it was for the good of the empire. I convinced myself that a strong emperor couldn't afford the luxury of personal feelings. But watching you on that auction block, seeing what I had become, his voice broke. And for a moment, the most powerful man in the world looked like nothing more than a middle-aged father who had lost his way. Amaris reached out and touched his arm, the first voluntary physical contact between them since the day of the auction. Where are they now? Safe, comfortable. They have new names, new identities, money enough to live well wherever they choose. But they'll never be able to return to Rome, never be able to acknowledge who they really are. He looked at her with eyes that held 8 years of accumulated regret. They'll grow up thinking their father chose power over love, and they'll be right. No, Amaris said firmly. They'll grow up thinking their father made an impossible choice in an impossible situation. That's different, is it? Before she could answer, the sound of running footsteps interrupted their conversation. A young messenger, still breathing hard from his sprint across the city, dropped to one knee before the emperor. Caesar, urgent news from the north. Crassus has taken Florence without a fight. The garrison commander opened the gates and declared for the rebellion. Drustanus felt the familiar weight of crisis settling on his shoulders. Florence controlled the main road to Rome. Its loss meant that Crassus could march his legions directly to the capital without opposition. What about the other northern cities? He asked, uncertain, Caesar. Our spies report that several more garrison commanders are wavering. They're waiting to see whether Rome will send reinforcements or whether they should surrender before Crassus arrives. The emperor nodded grimly. In civil wars, momentum was everything. Once commanders began defecting to the other side, others would follow like dominoes, falling in sequence. Send word to General Varro, I want the Praetorian Guard ready to march within the hour. We'll intercept Crassus before he can reach the city walls. The messenger bowed and departed at a run, leaving Drustanus and Amaris alone among the roses. The peaceful moment in the garden now seemed like a luxury they could no longer afford. You're going to fight him personally, Amaris observed. It was not a question. If I stay in Rome and send my generals to face him, it will look like cowardice. In civil wars, emperors who hide behind their palace walls don't keep their thrones very long, and if you lose... Drustanus was quiet for a moment, considering possibilities he had been avoiding. If I lose, Crassus will enter Rome as the new emperor. He'll need to eliminate any potential threats to his rule, which means anyone who supported me will face exile or death, including me, especially you. The emperor turned to face her fully, his expression serious. You represent everything he despises about my reign. Mercy shown to enemies, resources wasted on the weak, emotion valued over calculation. He won't be content simply to re-enslave you. He'll make your death a public spectacle to demonstrate the consequences of my weakness. Amaris absorbed this information with the same calm acceptance she had shown when facing slavery 8 years earlier. Then I suppose we had better make sure you don't lose. We? Drustanus raised an eyebrow. Amaris, you're not a soldier. You have no training in warfare or politics. The kindest thing I could do would be to arrange safe passage out of the Empire before the fighting begins. And go where? She asked, echoing their earlier conversation. Hide in some distant province while the man who saved me from slavery fights for his life. Pretend that I don't care what happens to the only person who has treated me as a human being rather than property. She stepped closer, and he could see determination burning in her green eyes like emerald fire. You said that seeing me on the auction block reminded you of who you used to be. Well, being here with you has reminded me of something I had forgotten, that even in the darkest circumstances, people can choose to hope instead of despair, to fight instead of surrender. This isn't your fight, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Yes, it is. Amaris reached up and touched the bronze pendant at her throat, the last remnant of her destroyed world. My village died because they chose to help people who had nowhere else to go. My family died defending the idea that some things are worth fighting for, even when victory seems impossible. If I run now, their sacrifice means nothing, she paused, looking up at the olive tree whose ancient branches had sheltered so many crucial conversations. Besides, she added with a small smile, you're going to need all the help you can get. And I know something about Crassus that your generals don't. Drustanus stared at her in surprise. What do you mean? I mean that 8 years ago, before your legions destroyed my village, we harbored a deserter from his army, a man who told us stories about his former commander, stories that might be very useful in the days ahead. As they walked back toward the palace to prepare for war, Drustanus found himself marveling at the strange turns his life had taken. 6 months ago, he had been the unchallenged ruler of the known world, secure in his power and certain of his destiny. Now he was preparing to risk everything he had built for the sake of a girl who had somehow become more precious to him than an empire. But perhaps, he thought, that was exactly what his father's journal had been trying to tell him all along. The war room fell silent as Amaris spread a hand-drawn map across the oak table, its edges weighted down with bronze coins. Unlike the official military charts that covered the walls, this crude sketch showed details that no Roman cartographer had ever recorded: hidden paths through mountain valleys, secret caves used by smugglers, and most importantly, the location of a fortress that appeared on no imperial survey. This is where Marcus Tertius took me, she said, pointing to a mark high in the Apennine foothills. Crassus's personal stronghold, built 20 years ago when he was consolidating power in the northern provinces. General Varro leaned forward, studying the rough drawings with professional interest. We have no intelligence about any fortress in that region, because it was built with slave labor, and all the slaves were killed when construction was complete, Amaris replied matter-of-factly. Marcus was the only survivor. He escaped during the final massacre and eventually made his way to our village. Senator Cassius looked skeptical. And you believe this deserter's story? Men fleeing their military service often fabricate tales to justify their cowardice. Marcus didn't flee, Amaris interrupted, her voice carrying an edge that made the senator fall silent. He was ordered to participate in the execution of the construction crews. When he refused, Crassus had him flogged and left for dead. He spent 3 months recovering in our village before your legions arrived. Drustanus studied the map, his strategic mind already calculating the implications of what Amaris was revealing. What else did he tell you about this fortress? It's more than just a military installation. Crassus has been using it as a treasury for his private wealth. Gold skimmed from provincial taxes, profits from illegal slave trading, bribes from merchants seeking favorable treatment. Marcus estimated that there was enough wealth hidden there to fund a private army for years. The emperor exchanged glances with his military advisors. If Amaris was correct, they had just discovered the financial foundation of Crassus's rebellion. More importantly, they had found a target that could cripple their enemy's ability to sustain a prolonged campaign. How many men guard this fortress? Admiral Nautilus asked. Marcus said no more than 50, but they're all veterans personally loyal to Crassus. The location itself provides most of the defense. It's built into a cliff face with only one approach, and that path can be easily defended by a handful of archers. General Varro frowned. If it's so well defended, how do you propose we take it? Amaris smiled, an expression that reminded everyone present that she had once fought Roman legionaries with nothing but a bronze-headed spear. Marcus also told me about the water supply. She traced a line on her map that led from a mountain spring to the fortress walls. Crassus diverted a stream to provide fresh water, but the original channel still exists. It's partially collapsed, but a small group might be able to crawl through it and emerge inside the stronghold. Might be able, Senator Cassius repeated. You're proposing that we risk an emperor's life on the word of a dead deserter and the memories of a former slave? I'm proposing that we take a calculated risk to strike at the heart of our enemy's power, Drustanus said quietly. If we can capture Crassus's private treasury and the documents it undoubtedly contains, we can expose the corruption that has funded his rebellion. The political damage would be devastating, but even as he spoke, the emperor was thinking beyond the immediate tactical advantages. There was something in Amaris's manner, something in the way she had presented this information, that suggested she was holding back crucial details. There's more, he said, watching her face carefully. What aren't you telling us? Amaris was quiet for a long moment, her green eyes reflecting the lamplight like still water. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of a confession 8 years in the making. Marcus wasn't just a deserter from Crassus's army. He was Crassus's son. The war room erupted in shocked voices. General Varro's hand moved instinctively to his sword hilt, while Senator Cassius began sputtering questions that died half-formed on his lips. Explain, Drustanus commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. Marcus Crassus Tertius was the general's eldest son, born to a Celtic woman he conquered during his early campaigns. Crassus acknowledged him, but never legitimized him. He was useful as a military commander, but could never inherit political power. Amaris's voice remained steady, despite the bombshell she was dropping. When Marcus refused to participate in the massacre of the slave workers, his father disowned him and ordered his execution. The flogging was meant to be a public example, but Marcus survived and escaped. And he told you all of this? Admiral Nautilus asked skeptically. He told us everything over the course of 3 months. He was dying slowly from his wounds and from fever. He knew he would never leave our village alive, so he wanted someone to know the truth about his father. Amaris looked directly at Drustanus. He made me promise that if I ever had the chance, I would use his information to stop Crassus from becoming emperor. The implications hit the room like a thunderclap. If Amaris's story was true, they had just learned that their enemy had murdered his own son, a crime that would shock even hardened Roman sensibilities. More practically, they now had detailed intelligence about Crassus's most secret stronghold from someone who had helped design its defenses. Why didn't you tell us this earlier? Senator Cassius demanded. Because until 3 days ago, I was a slave with no power and no voice, Amaris replied calmly. And because I needed to be certain that Emperor Drustanus was the kind of man who would use this information to serve justice, rather than just another form of tyranny. She turned to face the Emperor directly, and in her eyes he saw both challenge and invitation. Marcus made me promise something else, she continued. He made me swear that if I ever met his father's enemy, I would offer to guide them through the secret passages he had shown me. He died believing that someday someone would make Crassus pay for his crimes. Drustanus felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders like a purple cloak. The girl he had saved from slavery was offering him the key to victory, but at a price that went far beyond military tactics or political maneuvering. "You're asking me to trust you with my life," he said. "Yes, you're asking me to follow you into a trap that could be designed to deliver me directly to my enemies. Yes, you're asking me to stake the future of the Empire on the dying words of a man I've never met and the memories of someone who has every reason to hate Rome and everything it represents." Amaris nodded, her expression serious but unafraid. "I'm asking you to trust that sometimes the most unlikely people become the instruments of justice. I'm asking you to believe that the son Crassus murdered might still have the power to bring him down." The war room fell silent as everyone waited for the emperor's decision. Outside, Rome prepared for siege, while enemy legions marched closer with each passing hour. Inside, a man who had spent 8 years learning to trust no one faced the choice of placing his faith in a girl whose village he had destroyed. Finally, Drustanus spoke. "How many men would we need for this mission?" "No more than 20. The passage is narrow, and a larger group would be impossible to conceal, and you would guide us personally. Marcus showed me the way. I'm the only one who knows the route he would have taken to reach his father's private chambers." General Varro cleared his throat. "Caesar, with respect, this is madness. You're the emperor. You cannot risk yourself on such a mission." "Can't I?" Drustanus looked around the room at his advisors, seeing in their faces the same fear and calculation that had governed his own choices for so many years. "For 8 years, I've sent other men to take the risks while I stayed safe behind palace walls. Perhaps it's time I remembered what it means to lead from the front." He turned back to Amaris, and in that moment, she saw not the emperor who had destroyed her world, but the man who had chosen to save her from slavery at the cost of everything he held dear. "When do we leave?" he asked. "Tonight," she replied, "before Crassus realizes that his son's secrets are no longer buried with him." The moon was a thin silver crescent in the star-filled sky as 21 figures moved through the darkness of the Apennine foothills. They traveled on foot, their horses left behind at a shepherd's hut 5 miles back, their armor and weapons wrapped in cloth to prevent the metallic sounds that might betray their presence to enemy. Scouts Emperor Drustanus had exchanged his purple cloak for the rough brown tunic of a common soldier, though the bronze dagger at his side and the way he carried himself still marked him as a man accustomed to command. Beside him, Amaris moved with the silent grace of someone who had learned to hunt in these mountains as a child, her knowledge of the terrain proving invaluable as they navigated paths that appeared on no Roman map. The strike force consisted of hand-picked volunteers from the Praetorian Guard, each sworn to secrecy and chosen for their ability to move quietly through hostile territory. General Varro had wanted to come himself, but Drustanus had ordered him to remain in Rome to coordinate the city's defenses. If this mission failed, the Empire would need experienced leadership to face the consequences. "How much further?" whispered Marcus Brutus Maximus, the emperor's bodyguard, who had refused to be left behind despite direct orders to remain at the palace. Amaris paused beside a distinctive rock formation, 3 standing stones that her people had called the Giant's Crown. 2 more hours to reach the fortress walls. Another hour to find the entrance to the water channel. She had been over the route a dozen times with the strike force, drawing detailed maps and answering every question the soldiers could think of. But maps and words could only convey so much. The real test would come when they reached the cliff. Faison had to locate a passage that might have been sealed or collapsed in the 8 years since Marcus Tertius had shown it to her. "Tell me again about the internal layout," Drustanus said as they resumed their careful advance. "The main entrance leads to a central courtyard surrounded by barracks, storerooms, and guard towers. Crassus's private quarters are built into the cliff itself, accessible through a tunnel that connects to his treasure chamber. Amaris spoke in the same calm tone she had used during their planning sessions, but Drustanus could hear the underlying tension. Marcus said his father trusted no one with knowledge of the treasure room's location. He always went there alone, usually late at night when the guards were focused on their watch duties. The Emperor nodded, reviewing their strategy once more. If they could reach Crassus's private chambers undetected, they would have access to both the gold that funded his rebellion and the documents that could expose his corruption. More importantly, they would have the man himself, alive if possible, dead if necessary. But the mission carried risks that went far beyond personal danger. If they failed, if Drustanus was captured or killed, the Empire would face chaos that made civil war look like a minor political disagreement. Crassus would enter Rome as a liberator, claiming that he had saved the state from an emperor who had lost his mind. The treasury bid would be cited as evidence of Drustanus's unfitness to rule, and Amaris would be displayed as proof of foreign influence corrupting imperial judgment. "You're thinking too much," Amaris observed quietly, falling into step beside him as they climbed a steep section of the mountain path. "I'm thinking about consequences," he replied. "About what happens to Rome if we fail tonight, and what happens if we succeed." It was a question that had haunted him throughout their preparations. Victory tonight would eliminate Crassus as a threat and provide evidence of his corruption, but it would not address the underlying problems that had made rebellion possible. The senators who questioned Drustanus's judgment would not suddenly embrace his vision of a more merciful empire simply because he had won a military victory. "If we succeed," he said carefully, "we buy time to address the real challenges facing the empire. The corruption, the inequality, the endless cycle of conquest and oppression that breeds new enemies faster than we can defeat the old ones." Amaris smiled in the darkness. "You mean we buy time to become the kind of leader your father wrote about in his journal?" "Perhaps. If I remember how." They continued climbing in comfortable silence, each lost in private thoughts about the night ahead. Around them, the Praetorian guards moved with professional efficiency, their years of training evident in every careful step. These were men who had sworn to die protecting their emperor. And tonight, that oath would be tested in ways that no ceremony could have prepared them for. As they reached a plateau that offered a clear view of the surrounding peaks, Amaris suddenly held up her hand for silence. In the distance, barely visible against the darker mass of the mountains, a dim light flickered, the signal fire of a watchpost. "Crassus's outer perimeter," she whispered. "We'll need to be even more careful from here on." The next hour passed with agonizing slowness as they circled around the known guard positions, using game trails and rocky ledges that offered concealment from watching eyes. Twice, they had to freeze in complete stillness as patrols passed nearby. The soft sound of sandals on stone and the low murmur of conversation carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. Finally, as the eastern sky began to show the first pale hints of dawn, they reached their destination, a cliff face that rose straight up into the darkness, its surface broken by natural ledges and man-made fortifications. Somewhere above them, hidden behind stone walls and iron gates, lay the secret fortress that had funded Crassus's rebellion. There, Amaris pointed to what appeared to be a solid rock wall at the base of the cliff. Marcus said the original stream channel was diverted right about here. The opening should be behind those fallen boulders. The Praetorian guards spread out to provide security, while Amaris and Drustanus examined the base of the cliff face. Up close, they could see that what had appeared to be natural rockfall was actually a deliberate attempt to conceal something. The boulders had been carefully arranged to hide a dark opening just wide enough for a single person to crawl through. "This is it," Amaris confirmed, running her hands along the stone edges. The channel curves upward about 50 feet in, then levels out before entering the fortress's lower chambers. Brutus examined the opening with a soldier's eye for tactical problems. "It's barely wide enough for one person. If we get trapped inside, We don't get trapped, Drustanus said firmly. Amaris goes first to guide us. I follow, then the rest of you in single file. If anything goes wrong, those still outside withdraw immediately and return to Rome with word of what happened. And leave you behind. Brutus's tone made it clear what he thought of that particular order. And save the empire from the chaos that would follow if we all died together, the emperor replied. That's not a request, Marcus. It's a direct command. The bodyguard nodded reluctantly, understanding the logic even if he didn't like it. Around them, the other guards made final preparations, checking weapons, adjusting equipment, and mentally rehearsing the route they had studied so carefully. Amaris knelt beside the hidden entrance, her hand touching the bronze pendant at her throat. For a moment, she seemed to be listening to voices only she could hear, the whispered guidance of a dead deserter, the blessings of a destroyed village, the hopes of a people who had believed that even the darkest tyranny could be overcome by courage and determination. Marcus Tertius, she said softly, if you're watching from whatever realm holds the spirits of the dead, help us finish what you started. She turned to face Drustanus, and in the pale pre-dawn light her young face seemed older, marked by a wisdom that came from surviving the unthinkable and choosing to hope anyway. Once we enter that passage, there's no turning back, she said. Beyond this point, we're committed to either victory or death. I understood that the moment I decided to bid the treasury of Rome for your freedom, Drustanus replied. Some choices change everything, and there's no returning to the way things were before. He looked back at his guards. 20 men who had volunteered to follow their emperor into what might be a trap. Driven by loyalty that went deeper than duty or fear, they represented the best of what Rome could be. Courage in service of justice, strength used to protect rather than oppress, honor that could not be bought or corrupted. For Marcus Tertius, he said quietly, for the innocent dead of Thyrsus, for the hope that an empire built on conquest might yet learn to value mercy. For Rome, the guards replied in unison, their voices barely audible but filled with conviction that seemed to echo off the mountain walls. As Amaris disappeared into the dark opening and the emperor prepared to follow her into the unknown, the first rays of sunlight touched the peaks around them, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded everyone present why this place was worth fighting for. The final battle for the soul of the empire was about to begin. The water channel was everything Marcus Tertius had described, and worse. What had once been a flowing stream was now a cramped tunnel filled with stagnant pools, fallen rocks, and the thick darkness that comes from being buried deep within stone. The air was thin and stale, forcing the infiltrators to control their breathing carefully as they crawled forward on hands and knees. Amaris led the way, her fingers reading the tunnel walls like a blind woman reading script. 8 years had passed since Marcus had guided her through this route in her dreams and dying whispers, but muscle memory and mountain-born instincts served her well. Behind her, she could hear the careful breathing of Emperor Drustanus as he followed her through passages barely wide enough for human bodies. Left here, she whispered, so softly that only the emperor could hear. The tunnel branched, and one path led upward while the other curved away into complete darkness. Marcus said the right passage leads to the old cistern, a dead end now. They had been crawling for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes. The Praetorian guards behind them moved with disciplined silence, their weapons wrapped and secured to prevent any sound that might alert the fortress defenders above. Every scrape of metal on stone, every inadvertent grunt of effort, could mean discovery and death. The tunnel began to slope upward more steeply, and Amaris felt the first hint of moving air against her face, a sign that they were approaching the fortress's interior. Somewhere ahead lay the chamber where Crassus had diverted the original stream, and beyond that, if Marcus had told the truth, access to the treasure rooms and private quarters of the man who sought to destroy their emperor. Stop, she breathed, so quietly that the word was more felt than heard. Light, faint, indirect, but definitely light filtering down from somewhere above. They had reached the point where the water channel entered the fortress proper, and from here on, every movement carried the risk of detection. Amaris crept forward another few feet, until she could see the source of the illumination, a iron grating that separated the tunnel from what appeared to be a storage chamber. Beyond the grating, she could make out wooden crates, clay amphorae, and the kinds of supplies that would be stockpiled in a mountain stronghold. She turned back to whisper to Drustanus. The grating. Marcus said there would be a release mechanism on our side. His father wanted to be able to escape through the water. Channel if the fortress was ever overrun. The Emperor nodded and carefully moved up beside her in the narrow space. Together, they examined the iron barrier by the dim light filtering through from the chamber beyond. At first, it appeared to be solidly fixed in place, but closer inspection revealed a hidden catch, a bronze lever disguised as part of the decorative metalwork. Drustanus reached for the lever, then paused. Once they opened this barrier, they would be committed to the most dangerous part of their mission. There would be no retreat through the tunnel if things went wrong. The grating would have to be left open behind them, creating an obvious sign of their infiltration route. "Ready?" he asked, his voice barely a breath of sound. Amaris nodded, her hand moving to touch the bronze pendant at her throat one more time. "For Marcus Tertius," she whispered. The lever moved smoothly, clearly maintained despite years of disuse. The grating swung inward on well-oiled hinges, opening just wide enough for a person to crawl through. Beyond lay the storage chamber, dimly lit by oil lamps in the corridor outside. Amaris went first, emerging from the tunnel like a ghost materializing from solid stone. The chamber was larger than it had appeared from the tunnel, perhaps 20 feet square, filled with the supplies needed to sustain a garrison through a lengthy siege. She moved quickly to the doorway and peered out into the corridor beyond, empty. The hallway stretched in both directions, lit by oil lamps placed at regular intervals. To the right, she could see steps leading upward toward what were probably the main living quarters. To the left, the corridor curved away into darkness, the direction Marcus had said would lead to his father's private chambers. Drustanus emerged from the tunnel behind her, followed by Brutus and then the first of the Praetorian guards. One by one, they infiltrated the fortress, each man checking his weapons and equipment as he entered the chamber. "Which way?" Brutus whispered, though his eyes were already studying the corridor layouts and calculating tactical approaches. "Left," Amaris replied. "The private chambers are built into the cliff face itself, connected to the main fortress by that corridor." As they prepared to move deeper into enemy territory, the sound of footsteps echoed from somewhere above, guards making their regular rounds, unaware that their fortress had already been breached. The infiltrators froze, weapons ready, until the sounds faded away into the distance. "Remember," Drustanus said quietly, addressing his men in the tone of a general briefing his troops before battle, "we're here for Crassus and his treasury, not to fight a pitched battle. If we're discovered before we reach our target, withdraw through the tunnel and seal it behind you." The Praetorian guards nodded their understanding, though their expressions made it clear they had no intention of abandoning their emperor, regardless of his orders. As they moved out of the storage chamber and into the fortress proper, Amaris felt the weight of destiny settling around them like a shroud. Somewhere in the chambers ahead waited the man who had murdered his own son and sought to destroy the emperor, who had chosen mercy over vengeance. The final confrontation was about to begin. The corridor leading to Crassus's private chambers was a masterwork of paranoid design. Every 20 feet, the passage turned at sharp angles that would prevent attackers from seeing more than a few yards ahead. Murder holes had been cut into the ceiling at regular intervals, and the walls bore the scorch marks of oil that could be ignited to incinerate anyone foolish enough to assault the stronghold's inner sanctum. But Marcus Tertius had known his father's defenses intimately, and his whispered instructions to Amaris had included the locations of hidden passages that bypassed the most dangerous choke points. Moving like shadows, the strike force followed routes that led through servants' corridors and maintenance tunnels, Avoiding the main thoroughfares where guards might patrol, they passed through what had once been Crassus's son's quarters, chambers that had been sealed since Marcus's disgrace and exile. Dust covered everything, creating the eerie impression of a shrine to a dead man's disappointed hopes. Amaris paused beside a desk where scrolls still lay open, their Latin text describing military engineering techniques that Marcus had been studying before his final confrontation with his father. "He was brilliant," she whispered to Drustanus, touching one of the scrolls with gentle reverence. "Marcus could have been a great general, a builder of cities, instead of a destroyer of them. But he chose conscience over ambition." The emperor nodded, understanding now why this dead man's memory meant so much to her. In Marcus Tertius, she had found proof that even the sons of tyrants could choose a different path, a lesson that gave meaning to her own survival and purpose to her current mission. Beyond the sealed chambers lay the heart of Crassus's fortress, his private study and the treasure vault that had funded his rebellion. As they approached the final corridor, Brutus held up his hand for silence. Voices were audible from the chambers ahead, speaking in the low, urgent tones of men discussing matters of war and politics. "Legions will reach Rome in 3 days," a voice was saying. Familiar, authoritative, unmistakably that of General Maximus Crassus himself. "The Senate is already wavering. Half of them will declare for us before we reach the city gates. And if Drustanus chooses to fight?" The second voice belonged to someone younger, probably one of Crassus's lieutenants. "Then he'll die a traitor's death, and history will remember him as the emperor who bankrupted Rome for a slave girl's affections." Crassus's laugh was harsh, without humor. "The people will thank us for removing such weakness from the throne." Amaris felt anger rise in her chest like a flame fed by mountain wind. This was the man who had murdered his own son for refusing to participate in massacre, who spoke of mercy as if it were a disease that needed to be cured. But beside her, Drustanus remained calm, his face showing the controlled focus of a general preparing for battle. Using hand signals, he deployed his men around the chamber entrance. The Praetorian guards took positions that would allow them to storm the room from multiple angles, while Brutus prepared to cover their emperor's advance. Everything depended on surprise. Once Crassus realized he had been infiltrated, he would undoubtedly have ways to summon help or destroy evidence of his crimes. "The girl dies first," Crassus was saying as they moved into position. "Publicly, painfully, as an example of what happens when foreign influence corrupts Roman leadership. Then we'll display Drustanus's head on the Forum Romanum and proclaim the restoration of traditional values." That was enough. Drustanus stepped into the chamber entrance, his presence filling the doorway like an avenging god. Behind him, 20 Praetorian guards emerged from concealment with weapons drawn, their bronze armor gleaming in the lamplight. "Hello, Maximus," the emperor said conversationally, as if he had just encountered an old friend at a dinner party. "Discussing my funeral arrangements without an invitation? How rude." The effect was instantaneous. Crassus spun toward the voice, his weathered face cycling through disbelief, shock, and finally calculation as he assessed his situation. His lieutenants reached for their weapons, but froze as they realized they were outnumbered and surrounded. "Drustanus," Crassus's voice carried grudging admiration along with obvious hatred. "I should have known you wouldn't wait passively for death. But this changes nothing. My legions still march on Rome, and the Senate still questions your fitness to rule." "Perhaps," the emperor replied, stepping fully into the chamber. Behind him, Amaris entered as well, her presence causing Crassus's eyes to narrow with interest and contempt. "But they'll have questions about your fitness as well. When they learn about your private treasury and the methods you've used to fund your rebellion." Crassus glanced toward a heavy wooden door that presumably led to his treasure vault. "You have no proof of anything illegal, don't we?" Amaris spoke for the first time, her voice carrying across the chamber like a clear mountain stream. "Marcus Tertius told me everything before he died. About the slave workers you murdered to keep your secrets. About the provincial taxes you diverted to your private accounts. About the son you killed for refusing to participate in your crimes. For the first time since their arrival, Crassus showed genuine emotion, a flicker of something that might have been pain or regret before his features hardened into their familiar mask of ambitious calculation. Marcus was weak, he said finally, like his mother. Like everyone who mistakes sentiment for strength. No, Amaris replied, stepping closer despite the obvious danger. Marcus was brave enough to choose compassion over power. That's why his memory will outlive your empire of fear. The chamber fell silent, except for the sound of breathing and the distant crackle of oil lamps. Two visions of Roman leadership faced each other across a space that suddenly seemed to contain the entire future of the empire, one built on strength and conquest, the other on mercy and justice. The moment that would determine everything was at hand. The trial of General Maximus Crassus became the most significant legal proceeding in Roman history, not for its verdict, which was never in doubt, but for what it revealed about the empire's capacity for justice over vengeance. The treasure vault beneath his mountain fortress had yielded not just gold stolen from provincial taxes, but detailed records of corruption that implicated dozens of senators, governors, and military commanders throughout the empire. Standing before the assembled Senate 6 months later, Emperor Drustanus held in his hands the bronze pendant that had once belonged to a 17-year-old girl from a mountain village called Thyrsus. The simple ornament caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the chamber's high windows, seeming to glow with the memory of everything that had brought them to this moment. "Honored senators," he began, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had seen him through civil war and political upheaval. "We gather today not to celebrate victory, but to acknowledge the cost of the choices that brought us here." In the galleries above, citizens of Rome listened with an attention that transcended mere political interest. The story of the slave girl who had cost an emperor his treasury and helped him save his empire had spread throughout the known world, growing in the telling until it resembled the legends told about gods and heroes. But those who had lived through the events knew that the reality was both simpler and more profound than any myth. Amaris sat in the section reserved for honored guests, wearing the white toga of a Roman citizen, a status that had been formally granted to her, along with a villa in the countryside and enough gold to live comfortably for the rest of her life. But more important than legal freedom was the deeper liberation that came from seeing justice served and mercy vindicated. The documents recovered from Crassus's stronghold have revealed corruption that reached into every corner of our administration, Drustanus continued. Taxes that should have fed the hungry were diverted to private accounts. Funds meant to pay our legions were stolen to finance personal ambitions. The trust that binds citizens to their government was betrayed for the sake of individual greed. Senator Cassius, one of the few senior officials whose name had not appeared in Crassus's records, cleared his throat nervously. "And what does your Imperial Majesty propose to do about these irregularities?" "We begin by returning what was stolen to those who suffered from its theft," the Emperor replied. "The treasure recovered from the mountain fortress will be distributed to the provinces that were robbed, with priority given to communities that lost the most." Murmurs of approval rippled through the chamber. It was unprecedented for an emperor to voluntarily return wealth to the provinces. Most rulers treated distant territories as sources of tribute rather than partners in governance. Furthermore, Drustanus continued, "We will establish new procedures for financial oversight, with citizens' councils empowered to monitor tax collection and spending in their regions. The corruption that enabled Crassus's rebellion will not be allowed to take root again, but it was his final announcement that would be remembered by historians as the true turning point of his reign. Most importantly," he said, raising the bronze pendant so that everyone in the chamber could see it, "we must acknowledge that strength without justice is not strength at all, but merely another form of weakness. An empire that rules through fear alone cannot endure. It can only devour itself until nothing remains but the memory of what might have been. He paused, looking directly at Amaris, and in that exchange of glances lay 8 years of shared understanding about the price of power and the possibility of redemption. Therefore, I'm announcing the establishment of the Marcus Tertius Foundation, named for a young man who chose conscience over ambition and paid for that choice with his life. This foundation will provide assistance to communities recovering from war, support for families broken by conflict, and education for children orphaned by the violence that has marked too much of our history. The chamber erupted in surprise discussions. Such an institution was without precedent in Roman governance. Emperors built monuments to their victories, not memorials to their victims. As the senators debated the implications of these announcements, Amaris found herself thinking about the village of her birth, where simple people had believed that even the most powerful tyrants could be touched by compassion if approached with patience and hope. Her grandmother had been wrong about many things, but not about the fundamental truth that had sustained their people through generations of hardship, that every human heart, no matter how armored by ambition or hardened by experience, retained the capacity for change. Later that evening, as the sun set behind the 7 hills of Rome, Drustanus and Amaris walked together through the palace gardens where they had first begun to understand each other. The olive tree that had witnessed so many imperial conversations cast long shadows across the gravel paths, and the scent of roses filled the air with sweetness that reminded them both of simpler times. Do you ever wonder what Marcus Tertius would think of all this? Amaris asked, pausing beside the fountain where marble dolphins still spouted water in endless celebration of naval victories. That seemed less important now than they once had. I think he would be amazed that his father's victims could choose forgiveness over revenge, Drustanus replied. And I think he would be proud that his death contributed to something larger than just another change of emperors. They stood in comfortable silence as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Around them, Rome continued its eternal business, citizens returning home from work, merchants closing their shops, children playing in the streets, but the quality of that business had changed in ways both subtle and profound. Here was gradually giving way to hope, suspicion to trust, the logic of conquest to the possibility of peace. What happens now? Amaris asked. Drustanus smiled, feeling lighter than he had in years. Now we build something worth preserving for future generations. Now we prove that an empire can be great without being cruel. That strength can serve justice instead of merely serving itself. He looked at the bronze pendant that still hung around her neck, remembering the moment when he had first seen it glinting in the auction house. Sunlight. Now we honor the memory of everyone we've lost by becoming the kind of people they would have been. Proud to know. As they walked back toward the palace, neither of them knew that their story would be told for centuries to come. Not as a tale of political intrigue or military conquest, but as proof that even in the darkest times, the choice to value mercy over power could change the course of history itself.